So there's a very simple little, easy to see problem with the way linguistics fails to mesh with our knowledge of other things in the world, um, and refuses to acknowledge this. So here we have what I'm going to look at is the Clovis culture in North America and Afroasiatic languages. Now, these seem, I'm sure, at first blush to be radically irrelevant to each other. Let me read a little bit from the Wikipedia pages here. Okay, so just for some context, I'm going to give a little introduction into Afroasiatic so you kind of have an idea of what they are. So I'm reading off of the Wikipedia page. If you have problems with that, you can edit Wikipedia. Stop. Afroasiatic is a large language family of about 300 languages that are spoken predominantly in Western Asia, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa, and parts of the Sahel. With the exception of Semitic, all branches of Afroasiatic are spoken exclusively on the African continent. Okay. I'm going to skip a little bit. It does give some good information, but in addition to languages spoken today, Afroasiatic includes several important ancient languages, such as Ancient Egyptian, which forms a distinct branch of the family, and within the Semitic family, Akkadian, Biblical Hebrew, and Old Aramaic. There's no consensus among historical linguists concerning the original homeland or the period when the parent language was spoken. Okay, so at this point, I do want to highlight or reiterate one of my issues with linguistics, with historical linguistics, is the concept of a language family. This is the idea that there was an original language that just diversified into a whole bunch of other languages, and basically there were no external influences on this radiation, on this diversification. I personally feel like this is an impossible situation. This is a logically bankrupt way of looking at things, but there is value in things that, like, recognizing that something has been identified as a language family. Like, yes, all of these things that are identified in a language family, they do have a lot of striking similarities which are uncommon to other groups of languages, right? So, like, everything in this group, there's a lot going on that's similar. But that being said, there's a lot of ways that those similarities could have arisen, and the idea of a parent language, of a proto-language, is not the only way, but linguistics acts like it is. Or at least linguistics acts like this is the most reasonable default assumption. And I disagree. But that's okay. Because still, just know, like, if I'm talking about a language family, my interpretation of what that means is different than a conventional mainstream linguist, because I've actually thought about this problem and they haven't. But that's okay. Okay, so date of Afroasiatic. This is where we're going to come into some interesting things with Clovis. Okay, so this is still on the Wikipedia page, the little section date of Afroasiatic. And I am reading this on Wednesday, December 8th. So, as this was on December 8th. The earliest written evidence of an Afroasiatic language is an ancient Egyptian inscription dated to 3400 BC, so about 5400 years ago. Symbols on Gurzaean pottery, resembling Egyptian hieroglyphics, date back to about 600 years old, or about 4000 BC, suggesting an earlier possible dating. This gives us a minimum date for the age of Afroasiatic. So, at minimum, we're looking around 6,000 years old. But it is... So, however, I was going to paraphrase, but let's just fucking read it. However, ancient Egyptian is highly divergent from the hypothetical Proto-Afroasiatic. Note, any proto-language, whenever they're talking about a proto-language, it is hypothetical. They basically made it up based on evidence and speculation. So, yeah, there is never any physical evidence or anything for a proto-language. So, when they're saying here ancient Egyptian is highly divergent from Proto-Afroasiatic, take that with a grain of salt because, one, as I already mentioned, proto-languages are probably not even possible in reality anyway. And two, and there's details on that. I don't know if I've done a video on that, but if I haven't, I will. Let's see, where was I? Yeah, so not only are proto-languages, at best, they're not a good default assumption. They're also just fabricated, fanciful things. Like, yes, it's based on data. Yes, there's reason and logic that goes into it based on like analysis of extant languages and documented languages. That's true. But in most cases, there is more than one way to interpret a particular piece of data and extrapolate it back. There's almost always more than one way, and they have to do this for tens of thousands of pieces of data. So the chances that you're gonna get close are pretty much fuck all. You know, and in all honesty, like when you propose a proto-language, it's a really crappy guess. You know, assuming the proto-language for this family even existed in the first place, which personally, again, I think is unlikely. And that's for any language. I don't think proto-languages are really a possible thing. Okay, anyway, so yeah, so when they say ancient Egyptian is highly divergent from Proto-Afroasiatic, take that with a grain of salt. In considerable time, assuming that it is actually divergent from Proto-Afroasiatic, and their assumptions of what Proto-Afroasiatic looks like are accurate, then considerable time must have elapsed between them for ancient Egyptian to have changed so much. Time that requires time. That's what they're saying. Okay. So estimates of the date at which Proto-Afroasiatic languages were spoken vary widely. They fall within a range between approximately 7500 BC, which is almost 10,000 years ago, 9,500 years ago, and approximately 16,000 BC, which is about 18,000 years ago. And then some specific instances. Igor Diakonov in 1988 says that Proto-Afroasiatic was spoken around 10,000 BC. And Christopher Ehret, I don't know how to pronounce that name, it looks German or something, 2002 asserts that Proto-Afroasiatic was spoken around 11,000 BC, so a little bit older. And this is at the latest, right? So, and possibly as early as 16,000 BC. So that puts it at 18,000 years ago. And in general, these dates are older than those associated with other proto-languages. Okay, so we have here professional linguists for the last little more than 30 years saying that Afroasiatic as anything identifiable as Afroasiatic is somewhere on the order of 12,000 years old. Okay, now we get to Clovis. Clovis culture. The Clovis culture is again I'm reading from Wikipedia. The Clovis culture is a prehistoric Paleo-American culture named for distinct stone tools found in close association with Pleistocene fauna at Blackwater locality number 1 near Clovis, New Mexico in the 20s and 30s. So this is kind of when these artifacts were first discovered, so it's named for the location where it was first discovered. And that first discovery was in pretty much the 20s and 30s. So it appears around 11,500 to 11,000 uncalibrated radiocarbon years before present at the end of the last glacial period, and is characterized by the manufacture of Clovis points. and distinctive bone and ivory tools. So keep this in mind. So we have professional linguists putting the date of recognizable Afroasiatic languages at around 12,000 years ago at least, if not more. And here we have Clovis around 11,000. It's newer than Afroasiatic, than recognizably Afroasiatic things, according to hypotheses in linguistics. Mainstream hypotheses, mind you. Archaeologists' most precise determination at present suggests this radiocarbon age is equal to roughly 13,200 to 12,900 calendar years ago. So again, we're in range of Afroasiatic, over somewhere Middle East, Africa, something like that. Clovis people are considered to be the ancestors of most of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Okay, this is where it starts tying in to be relevant. So, we have something that looks like, probably, and I actually don't disagree with this. I just don't think it would be a proto-language necessarily. But we have something that looks like Afroasiatic, probably at least around 12,000 years ago, maybe as far back as 18,000 years ago. And realistically, if what they're doing with the reconstruction of the proto-language is they're identifying the point at which it starts to radiate. So it actually is going to exist prior to that anyway, probably by several thousand years. So, realistically, we can say that things looking like Afroasiatic could be as old as 25, maybe even 30,000 years old. 30,000 is probably a stretch that nobody should accept, but the possibility of it is reasonable. I'm not going to say with any confidence that it's anywhere near that old, but 20,000 years, I feel like you could say that with fair confidence, that at 20,000 years ago, you're going to have some language somewhere that looks considerably like an Afroasiatic language. And in some shape or form, this grows to radiate into the Afroasiatic language family. That doesn't require it to be the proto-language. It just requires it to be a major influence, a contributory language. You know, you can get creolization, you can get all sorts of things happening through trade, you can get lots of things happening here. Okay, so Afroasiatic is older than the radiation of Clovis through North America. And, let's see. Where can I, that doesn't tell us. Okay, this doesn't clearly say anything, but anyway, the only human burial that has been directly associated with tools from Clovis include the remains of an infant boy researchers named, so this is in North America, so I'm going to assume that the pronunciation that they're expecting for this is Anzac 1. Paleogenetic analyses of Anzac 1's ancient nuclear, mitochondrial, and Y chromosome DNA, so yes, it was a male, reveal that Anzac 1 is closely related to modern Native American populations, which lends support to the Beringia hypothesis for the settlement of the Americas. So the Beringia hypothesis is that these people came over to the North American continent from Asia over a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, roughly. Something like that. Okay, so the assumption is that these people are from Asia. Okay, these people come to North America, or the Americas in general, because there's also sites in like Chile that are older. So there were definitely people here. Anyway, so you have this colonization of the Americas from Eurasia during a time where a modern language family exists. As a convention in linguistics, in historical linguistics, and perceptions of, things like this, the world is assumed to be so large that contact between any sort of shared vocabulary between something like Asia and the Americas, or Europe and the Americas, or Africa and the Americas, it's just deemed to be so ludicrous that we can discount it as coincidence or random noise or something. But when you actually look at these languages and you're following the procedures, the correct procedures, where you're looking for systematic sound changes, you're looking for systematic semantic changes, or you're looking for very, very consistent semantics that are not changing at all, what you will find is that there is a large portion of Afroasiatic vocabulary present across Native North American and Central and South American languages, which exhibits very little sound change, little to no semantic change, and any sound changes that do occur are systematic. And the ages of these events corroborate the possibility of this occurring. We have recognizably the hypothesis in linguistics, mainstream linguistics, is that we very plausibly have something that looks like Afroasiatic occurring for thousands of years prior to this major colonization event of North America, which came from a region at least adjacent to where Afroasiatic would have been spoken. But we still are going to be like, oh no, this is just coincidence. It's just coincidence that the Hebrew word for man is Adam, and the Papago word for man is Adam. That's just coincidence. It's just coincidence that the Spanish word for with is con. The Chinese word for with is gun, and the Odom word for with is wam. Those sound shifts, those are very small sound shifts. When you're looking at the phonetics, those are very, very small sound shifts. So if that occurred over several thousand years, you wouldn't think anything of it. Within one language family, usually, those are just normal. But when it crosses language families and it crosses territories this vast, linguists are like, oh, no, it's just a random coincidence. Even though we have here, we can look at the age of Afroasiatic and the age of Clovis, and the Clovis is newer. This major colonization event of the American continents is more recent than the establishment of Afroasiatic. And core vocabulary in Afroasiatic seems to be appearing at weirdly high rates, much higher than chance, across North America, Native North American languages. And it's not like there's weird changes and there's weird cultural things attached to them, and there's weird semantic and syntactic things going on, and there's weird sound changes and all of this that seem to be so deeply ingrained that it's not from contact. It's not from European contact since about 1500 or 1490s. It's not from that. It can't be, because you're getting the same thing occurring across all of the Uto-Aztecan languages. And you're getting a slightly different but same thing occurring across like all of the Siouan languages. Right? There's systematicity here that indicates deep age, and it indicates some genuine ancient, deeply ancient commonality. And once you start accepting this, it really throws a wrench into a lot of the assumptions that come after, or sometimes before, historical linguistics. Because one of the assumptions is that languages change more or less at a certain rate. So sound changes should occur at a certain rate, and this makes languages past a certain period just inaccessible because there's too much noise in the signal at that point. But if we look at these things and we take them seriously, what we see is the possibility that certain words are so resilient to sound change that they actually might be driving sound change in other words that we're taking to be more core, right? So like between Adam in Hebrew and Adam in Tono Adam, Papago, Pima, those languages. Well, the D isn't changing. The D's the same. The M isn't changing. Sometimes it goes to N, like in Navajo, you get the ne. Or Chinese has an N and also Zhen. But that's a very systematic change from an M to an N. This is a very small change that's plausible, totally plausible. It also shows up systematically. So like all of the things that look, like Hebrew vocabulary in Navajo that has an M in Hebrew has an N in Navajo. Like it's systematic. This is very strong evidence if we're really looking at the data, if we're really taking it seriously. This is evidence that something profound happened in the deep past that actually completely undermines many assumptions made in linguistics. One of the main ones being that the world is just so big and that language change is just so fast that we can't see past a certain point and we can't see past certain distances. So we just look at little tiny regions and consider these people, these populations, to be absolutely isolated unto themselves for thousands and thousands of years. Well, but I mean, when you look at it, how long does it take to travel from China to Rome? We know it doesn't take that long because the Silk Roads existed, right? You had the North Silk Road, which was between like Lithuania, Latvia, that area, and China, and also straight south, the Amber Road. And then you had the Southern Silk Road, which was between, Europe and China. And this was traversed regularly. It would take a while, but you're making this trip well within a year, right? And it's easy enough that it's extremely profitable, right? So looking at Rome and China as completely isolated from each other, even though we know they traded with each other, that's ludicrous. That's insane. What are you doing? But also, like, we don't have any specific evidence for when this sort of trade started. It probably was already a well-established thing, I think. It was probably already a well-established thing by the time the first civilizations are cropping up. I think more likely than not, Homo erectus was participating in something like this. Maybe not quite as grand and quite as systematized, and but The fact that you can make that trek from China to Rome, or China to Egypt, or something like that, in well within a year, easily enough that it's profitable later on, with basically by foot. Why are you assuming that the world is so small that there's not going to be contact? That there's not going to be vocabulary borrowing? Of course there is. Of course there is. You develop a technology or a material or something, some good that has value to other people in one region of Eurasia, it's going to spread across Eurasia. It just is. And also along with that is going to be the names for the things. Right? And if the techniques for manufacturing it spread too, the names for those things are also going to spread. So you're going to get, I think, in the Bronze Age, you're going to get this sort of mass explosion from both ends of Eurasia of vocabulary, and it's going to be mixing, and I think personally this explains very, very well what's going on with Indo-European and like Sino-Tibetan in particular. The massive growth of those two language families. I don't think there was a proto-language there. I think what's happening is because what we're doing is we're looking at these massive regions of influence where, like, these big production centers, big cultural regions. What's happening is probably the vocabulary is just spreading for most of this stuff. But some of the core vocabulary, the really core vocabulary to the language, isn't spreading. And this is why branches of Indo-European look so radically different from each other, like Germanic from Italic. Like, the vocabulary that talks about Bronze Age technology is pretty much the same. The vocabulary that talks about Bronze Age lifestyle is pretty much the same. But the vocabulary that talks about Paleolithic stuff is different. And systematically so. So I think what's happening here, probably, is that it was something of a creolization event, like a trade pigeon basically established and kind of took over everything in the region, and so you get what are actually different languages adopting so much of the same vocabulary that they stop looking like they're unrelated to each other. They now look like they're related to each other. And I think this is kind of where a lot of language families came from. There wasn't really a proto-language. There was an event like this. But at a lower scale, this sort of thing is occurring all the time. You're getting spreads of this vocabulary all of the time, constantly, back throughout human history. Always. There wasn't a moment where it just started to happen, when there was documentation for it. If you talk to a linguist, they will only accept the shit that's documented. Like, oh, we can see that this happened in English. We can see that this happened in Latin. We can see that this happened in Chinese. So that's the first thing that we can say for sure happened. And to a degree, I get it. But it's ludicrous to assume that people don't trade with each other, don't talk to each other, don't spread information, don't have conflict with each other, don't deliberately, when they're in conflict with another group, deliberately change their vocabulary so that it looks different from them. So you might have things that look like a language family, but there's two factions. This is extremely common. When you look at language families, this is exceptionally common. There's almost always 2 or 3 major, rifts. Why? And it's in words. It's in vocabulary referring to things like good and bad and person and, devil or something like that, right? The the northern Indo-European words for bad look like the southern Indo-European words for good. Right? Like English, bad. Spanish, bueno. That N to D shift, that's a really common, very simple. N and D are virtually identical in the mouth. You're doing almost exactly the same thing. That's very plausibly the same word. Right. So you get these sorts of things occurring. But going all the way back, we're probably also having sharing like this. So the fact that you have something recognizably Afroasiatic, potentially like 20 to 30,000 years ago, very plausibly at least 20,000 years ago, prior to the radiation of Clovis across native North America. Yeah, it makes sense that there's gonna be some Afroasiatic looking vocabulary brought along with that expansion event. It's the mainstream denial that this is plausible is actually the claim that needs to be justified, because it takes almost nothing for what I'm proposing here to have been what happened. It's most likely something along the lines of what I'm saying. I don't need any special mechanisms. I don't need any magic. In order for the languages to be so isolated and distinct from each other, in the way that classical linguistics, mainstream linguistics wants you to believe, they have to propose extra mechanisms. They have to propose things that are not, there's no evidence for. They have to propose, like, basically what amounts to magic, except that they don't recognize this because they're all in agreeal with each other, because they're just like, oh, yeah, this is what I learned in school. So you didn't take what you learned in school and think about it? And you're a professional? You get paid to do this? You get paid to think about this and talk about it and write about it and research about it? And you never actually bothered to think about it? What the fuck? Anyway, okay, so yeah. This is one of those long, what's the point videos, I'm sure, right? Smash that dislike button.